So good morning, folks. Happy Friday. Welcome to this installment of the California Policy Forum. This is an ongoing quarterly webinar series. It's co-presented by the Philanthropy California Coalition, that's Northern California Grantmakers, Southern California Grantmakers, and Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial counties, as well as the California Association of Nonprofits, Cal Nonprofits, and the League of California Community Foundations. I'm Laura Seaman, CEO of the League. We're a statewide coalition of 30 place-based foundations across California. We're very grateful for the leadership and partnership of the Philanthropy California and Cal Nonprofits teams on this collaborative series and on today's webinar on ARPA funds. We're going to dive into the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, what it means for our communities in California. We're going to explore some opportunities and examples of engagement and advocacy and influenced by civil society leaders like yourselves across the nonprofit and funder spectrum. Thank you for taking the time to come together with us today. If you're just tuning in, please take a moment to introduce yourself, your organization. Let us know where in California you're joining us from. Let's get started. Let me hand it over to our co-moderators. Today's conversation will be facilitated by Lucy Salcido-Carter, who's Director of Public Policy at Cal Nonprofits, as well as by David Carroll, who's Vice President of Public Policy and Government Affairs at Southern California Grantmakers. Let me go ahead and pass it to David.
Thank you, Laura. Good morning. My name is David Carroll. My pronouns are he and him. As mentioned, I'm the VP of Public Policy with Southern California Grantmakers. Southern California Grantmakers is a philanthropic serving organization with about 300 members in our region. And we are 1/3 of Philanthropy California, which, as mentioned before, is a partnership between ourselves, Northern California Grantmakers, and Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial County. I am a Black man with medium-length hair and a beard, and I'm wearing a suit. The COVID-19 pandemic caused unimaginable challenges and harm to the world. In the United States, I could have never conceived 700,000 lives lost, kids not being in school, businesses closed, and on the lighter side, fights over toilet paper and starting to consider other options if it became unavailable. The pandemic caused us as a country to take a long look in the mirror as we tried to mitigate the damages from the pandemic. What we learned is what most of us on this call already knew, that BIPOC communities and those living in poverty were disproportionately affected by the pandemic at all levels, especially health and economically. Many of the wealthiest individuals have actually experienced increases in wealth during this pandemic. As I've heard said, it rains on both the rich and the poor, but the rich tend to have better umbrellas. The disparity caused a reckoning that highlighted the systemic inequalities that have always existed for these communities and the need to address these long-standing challenges as we began the process of recovery. Philanthropy has been working with nonprofits to address these inequalities by filling the gaps in funding and helping to provide services to marginalized communities. That is our charge, and it always will be. But today, as resources are flowing to cities and counties at levels never seen, we have the opportunity to create transformational changes in the landscape of inequity by leveraging governmental resources with philanthropic investment. It is our responsibility to make sure that marginalized communities are served in a way that truly provides transformation. It is our goal to make sure that those who are best suited to meet the needs of the community, the trusted nonprofits that have been serving them for years, have access to the COVID recovery resources. Today, we will be discussing the American Rescue Plan Act funding and likely touching on some unspent CARES Act funding. But I view this conversation as a broader roadmap for the equitable distribution of future recovery funds created by the American Jobs Plan, the American Rescue Plan, or versions thereof. I look forward to a robust conversation and hearing from our esteemed panelists. With that, I will pass to Lucy.
Thank you, Laura and David. Well, hello, everybody. As was said before, I'm Lucy Salcido-Carter. I'm the Policy Director at the California Association of Nonprofits, or Cal Nonprofits for short. We are a policy alliance of more than 10,000 organizations, and through our advocacy, we protect and enhance the ability of California nonprofits to serve our communities. So really glad to be part of this partnership and also this webinar. You know, during the pandemic, we have seen resources come through the CARES Act. David mentioned the CARES Act, and now through ARPA, which we'll hear more about in a minute, the American Rescue Plan Act. And we all know, nonprofits, funders, how important these resources are for our communities to help our communities weather the pandemic and other crises and to move forward and thrive. And Cal Nonprofits has fought really hard with our allies to push to make sure that nonprofits are part of other kinds of relief efforts like the California Small Business COVID-19 Relief Grant Program, which just ended recently. But I want to be really clear to everybody, the ARPA is not a grant program. It's not a specific grant program. It brings $42 billion to our state, counties, and cities as pass-through federal funds, and we'll hear more about the details of that. So this webinar is not about applying for a specific grant program. This webinar is about learning about what we can do in partnership with local government to help ensure that our communities are well served by the ARPA funds that are coming to us. It's an opportunity for us as nonprofits to engage in local advocacy, and we'll hear some examples of how to do that in just a few minutes. It's also an opportunity for us to learn about how to be at the budget table at the local level and to offer our expertise to that decision-making process. I really believe that nonprofits have an important role to play in helping to make sure that these funds are allocated equitably and in ways that truly help our communities. So I encourage you to take what we're all going to learn today. I'm really looking forward to learning a lot, and to reach out to our local officials and ask about ARPA funds in your area. See how you can help be part of the process, how you can bring your expertise to the table to help decide how these funds are spent. So with that, we're going to get started. Again, David's going to introduce our first speaker in just a second, but I did want to say again, we'll take some questions as we go, and we will reserve some time at the end to take more questions. And as Laura said, we probably won't get to all of them, but we'll get to as many as we can. So with that, David, back over to you.
Sure. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank and also introduce Jeff Neal, Legislative Representative for Government, Finance, and Administration at the California State Association of Counties. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, David. As David said, I'm Jeff Neal, Legislative Representative at CSAC, the California State Association of Counties. We're an association, a nonprofit membership association of all 58 counties in the state. We're governed by a board of directors that is comprised of elected county supervisors, one from each county in the state. And I am really pleased to be invited to speak to you all today, and honored to join the other panelists here. And I just want to give a relatively brief overview of the funds that have been made available to the state and the counties and the cities in California as part of the American Rescue Plan Act. We can go to the next slide. There's about $27 billion that went to the state of California, the state government. This is specifically, and what we'll be talking about, I think, through most of the webinar today, are specifically the state and local flexible fiscal recovery account. ARPA was a lot bigger than this. In addition to these flexible relief funds, it also funded, as I think many of you know, rent relief, utility relief, mortgage relief, enhanced unemployment insurance, childcare tax credits, funding for vaccines and testing and lab capacity, and tons of other things. But the part that we're focusing on here today are the state and local fiscal recovery funds. So the state of California got about $27 billion from that account, direct funds, and local agencies, counties and cities got $16 billion, half each to counties and cities, so about $8 billion roughly for each. Counties and many cities in the state got those funds directly from the U.S. Treasury Department. Non-entitlement cities, for those of you who also work with CDBG funds, those below 50,000 in population, it actually went through the state, but they still got the money. It wasn't state discretionary for the state whether to pass it on or not, which is one of the differences from the CARES funds that some of you might be familiar with from a previous federal bill, the coronavirus relief funds. For that, only jurisdictions, counties and cities over 500,000 got funds directly from the federal government. The rest of it went to the state. And in California, the state did decide to pass some of that state funding along to local agencies. Next slide. So in terms of the timelines, half of the money, as you can see on the slide, was received by local agencies when they applied for it, which they could have done anytime between late spring, early summer, and as recently as a couple of weeks ago, depending on when they wanted to get that money. You only get half of it, and then the other half comes next year. The costs have to be incurred or obligated by the end of 2024, and they have to actually be spent out the door with all work completed by the end of 2026. There's another difference from the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Funds. There are a few differences and similarities I want to point out because I think some people are familiar with that previous fund. One was the timeline. The Coronavirus Relief Funds were intended to go out immediately as a big shot in the arm to the coronavirus response, both the direct medical and public health response as well as economic fallout from it. Those funds were originally needed to be spent by December 31st, 2020, but that was later extended to December 31st, 2021, sort of right at the end it was extended. So a lot of folks had already spent that money. But one of the similarities is that none of this money can be spent on things like paying down debt or money going to pension funds or building up reserves. It all has to be spent. It all has to go to actual programs or grants, things like that. The CRF was a little bit tighter. It had a little tighter requirements. It had to be really directly related to the health or public health response or to the economic fallout. There was a little bit of give, but it was a little bit stricter. The ARPA funds have a little more leeway, but there's still restrictions that local agencies have to be aware of. The intent is still to respond to the pandemic and its economic fallout. We can go on to the next slide. So there are 4 uses. We've broken them out into 5 bullet points, but they're in the law they're broken into 4 subsections. So one of them is the first 2 bullet points here are the response to the COVID pandemic. That's both the medical, public health response, public safety response, human services, as well as the economic impact. So that can be to workers, to families, to businesses, to nonprofits, rehiring workers, things along those lines. The second item, the third bullet point here, is to replace public sector revenues. A lot of public agencies had a significant revenue decline due to the COVID pandemic and the responses to it. That varies quite a bit by region, not only in the nation, but also within California. And this is something that the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, was explicitly disallowed. You could not use it for revenue loss. But for ARPA, it's specifically included as something it can be used for. And so those funds can be used for any government purpose, but only if the local agency has experienced a revenue decline. And there's a formula that Treasury U.S. Treasury Department has put out for determining whether there's a revenue loss. It's a good time to point out that the regulations on the spending and how counties and cities can spend it are still technically interim rules. They were supposed to be finalized by now, but they got a lot of response when they asked for input. And so they're still possibility that some of that will be changed. And it's possible that the revenue loss calculation is one area that might be changed. So this slide has the items where the spending allowances are fairly broad, what it can be spent on. On the next slide, which we can go ahead and move on to, are the ones that are a little bit stricter. So one of them is paying premium pay for workers who were, that we'd call essential workers. There's basically hero pay, as it's frequently called. There are regulations on how much you can pay or what time period you can pay based on, but you can, counties, cities can apply it retroactively back to essentially the beginning of the pandemic, up to a certain amount per worker. And then the last item is necessary infrastructure for water, sewer, or broadband. So those are the things that counties and cities can use on. Like I said, the first slide had items that are pretty broad. They still do have to be related to the coronavirus for that first item, or if the agency has experienced revenue loss, really on any governmental program. And so you can move on to the last slide that just has my contact information, I think, if folks want to reach out after the webinar to get more information. But counties and presumably cities, not as much of an expert on what they're doing with their funds or the processes they're using. Different counties are making these decisions in different ways. Many of them, counties have to adopt a final budget by October 1st, which is the beginning of the federal fiscal year. And so while many counties adopt a preliminary budget by the beginning of the usual fiscal year on July 1st, most counties don't finalize them until October 1st. So a lot of counties have adopted, if not a specific plan, at least sort of a framework for how they're going to spend this money going forward. Of course, they only have half of the money. The rest of it's coming next year, either late in this fiscal year, at the beginning of next fiscal year. And they do still have 3 years to obligate that funding. So a lot of folks have adopted what I'll call medium-term plan framework for spending the money. A lot of it used on COVID, on vaccines, on staffing, on changing their own offices to adapt to our newly more remote working environment. A lot of folks are spending on homeless services. There's some spending on parks and libraries, things like flood control or roads or other infrastructure. Of course, those are only for those who had a revenue loss. And some, we just saw the news a couple of days ago that Santa Clara County, for example, has decided to spend some of it on what we'll call hero pay. There's a lot of diversity, and there's also diversity in how some of those funds are going out. I know, for example, that in Sonoma County, they've set up a community work group to advise them on how to spend the funds. And they're making an effort to include on that work group folks from disadvantaged communities and under-resourced communities. They're not alone in that. They're just a recent example that I saw. Some counties have also set up funds. Some did it for CRF as well, and now also for ARPA, are even putting together panels of folks to help them actually award the funds and not just advise on it. That might be some small business folks to determine which businesses might require and get grants from the funds or things along those lines. So I'm going to stop there for now. I'm happy to take any questions. I don't know if it's now or later as Lucy and David see fit.
Well, I've got one for you. We'll just take a few now just because I know we've got some more great information coming along, and it's helpful, I think, sometimes to clarify a few things as we go. Let's see, I am looking for, well, here's one. Do the counties and cities have any responsibility around process, like to set up community meetings to discuss where the funds will go? Are there any kind of process requirements related to ARPA?
There aren't requirements. Like I said, I know some counties are doing that. I gave the example of Sonoma. I know, if I remember correctly, and hopefully I am, it was Nevada County that I remember setting up one for CRF, for community advice. There isn't a requirement. There is a requirement that they report back to Treasury, to the US Treasury Department, how they are spending the funds. And those are interim reports that they have to make throughout the effective period. The first reports were originally going to be due just a couple of days ago, but that got delayed to, I think, next January. And I believe that was because they have not actually finalized the spending regulations yet.
Thanks.
David, do you have one? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. This one was asked a few times in the registration, as well as I see it again in the chat, more specific in the chat, but more generally, when can or will the county start to allocate and actually disperse the ARPA funds? I saw a little bit in the presentation. I just wanted to.
Yeah, I think now that that all counties have, as of a little over a week ago, adopted their final budgets for this year, I think that money will start to go out. The counties, like the state, many of them have set up a multi-year process, especially if it's for infrastructure. That's almost, required to be a multi-year process, just because it takes time to do the things when it comes to infrastructure, whether that's roads or sewers or sewer work or water work. So I think those funds will start to go out. In fact, I suspect that some of them have already started to go out for counties that claimed the money as soon as they could in the late spring, early summer, and who adopt a budget before July 1st. I think some will already have started to disperse that money over the summer.
Great, thank you, Jeff.
I see one question. Yeah, if I can take it real quick, just asking if an organization can, if they get it from the county, can they still get it from other places? There's no restriction on any of that. There's no exclusivity. If you get county ARPA funds, you're not disallowed from getting it from a city, for example. I just want to make that clear. I think that's a good thing to clarify.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I saw that was one of the questions, so you beat me to the punch there. But we've got another one here, and then we'll move on to our next speaker. But do you have any sense of when ARPA funds that the state appropriated in the July Budget Act will flow to programs? And the person who's asking is asking specifically about increased senior nutrition funding that's included in the state budget, but it would apply to any of the pass-through ARPA funds that are in the state budget. And I know you represent the counties, but if you know, it would be great.
That's fine. Actually, I got a similar question from my mother-in-law, who's the president of local Meals on Wheels, where she lives. And frankly, it depends on the program. And I can't speak specifically to senior nutrition, same answer I gave her. But it really depends on the program. So as one example, and the one that I'm most familiar with, related to broadband, on that one, we can't spend it all at once because it takes time not only to do the planning, but you can only do the work so much at a time. And I will drop maybe in the chat in a minute, maybe while the next speaker is going, the link to the state's ARPA funding plan, so they can see sort of all in one place what the state is spending that money on. So it depends on the program. On some of them, we will use this money to fund it continuously over the next couple of years, right? And other programs, it's designed to be a shot in the arm, right? Or like the rent relief, they're trying to get that money out the door as quickly as possible. And after a slow start, they're actually now doing, from what I understand, it's become a model nationwide for getting that money out. And actually, after the slow start, California is now in the top 10 of states, percentage-wise, getting that rent relief money out.
Well, that resource will be great. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for all your great answers to our questions. So we'll have more questions for Jeff towards the end of the webinar, but let's move on to our next speaker. Thank you, Jeff. And we're going to hear now from Michelle Byerly, who's the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Partnership. Nonprofit Partnership provides a range of tools and resources to help nonprofits in their region, which is the greater Long Beach area, to be successful. And they also do advocacy at the local level. And we're going to hear from Michelle more about what's been happening around ARPA in Long Beach. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. And hello, everyone out there. And Jeff, that was a great presentation. It helps to hear how the funding is being distributed from the state level so we can better understand how to advocate. So I learned something new from you. So thank you for your presentation. As Lucy said, I'm the executive director of the nonprofit partnership, and we are located in Long Beach. We serve LA County, but what I'm going to share with you is that where our advocacy has had the most and been the most effective has been really locally at the local level with the city of Long Beach. So we support organizations throughout LA County, but when this advocacy specifically moving the needle for nonprofit support and nonprofit support as businesses, there are funds, and I know Jeff talked about different buckets of funds that will come out for programming and health related funding, but also just support as a business that for their operations to get back in operations, that type of support we've been more successful locally in the city. So I'm going to share our experience of what helped to shape some of those policies, some of the recommendations that worked for us. This is also CARES funding and ARPA funding that I'll be talking about, but all of this is still relevant as funds continue to come through the community, and these different strategies and tactics will work in the communities that you're in too as funds are being rolled out and distributed. So the last thing before I jump into a little bit of a story about what happened is that we could never have done this alone. This is definitely a collective effort. I know Lucy mentioned we support organizations through trainings and workshops and convenings. Advocacy is a very small portion of what we do. There isn't a dedicated staff person to that, but we're all dedicated to finding resources for nonprofits, which is where this advocacy came in. And we wouldn't be able to do that without having other nonprofits who come to us with challenges or recommendations or areas where we could support advocacy in. So I just want to, I know some of them are probably on this call, but just think the other nonprofits and those leaders that have also helped the advocacy along the way. So when I was looking back this last week on what we have done in advocacy and attempt to kind of synthesize how we engaged with those in decision-making positions around these resources as they're coming down, just, to share our first initial interaction around kind of relief or recovery or these federal funds was when there were, it was back in March of 2020, there were small business loans that were made available to small businesses. And we started asking the city's economic development department questions about access to those funds for nonprofits. It wasn't something they had been asked or considered, but it was something they would consider, knowing that what we were sharing, that nonprofits were being impacted at the same rate that small businesses were at that point with, what we may be thought at that time was a temporary shutdown. But that really was affecting nonprofits. And so really being able to open up that dialogue early on about the needs that nonprofits were having, and also asking the question about what resources would be available. And when any small business resource became available, then where did nonprofits fit into that? Were nonprofits also being considered and just kind of grouped together, or was there going to be separate resources? So those were those effective strategies and those questions. It's really gaining understanding to where the access point is to funds for nonprofits, asking the people who are making decisions, and really utilizing our other nonprofits to find out this information as well. So we may hear from a nonprofit that they're looking for resources or got turned down in one way. And then we may go back to our other nonprofit advocates and leaders and ask them what's worked for them and try to move the needle on some of those things. So there, for different pools of funding, and this is just locally, so it could help you to kind of navigate locally in your own communities. The funding is going into different departments within the city. For business support, economic development is where these funds lie. We do have our own health department in the city of Long Beach, and the funding will go back and forth, but depending on where it's at and how it's flowing for nonprofits, it may come from the health department, it may come from economic development. We understand that these programs are being developed and rolled out very quickly. And so it may start in one place and move to another, depending on who has the most time. But continuing to ask questions once plans have been determined, ask questions on allocation and delivery. And really, there's many layers to that. It could be having a call with someone from the city manager's office or the person who's the lead on determining what language and ARPA is, has to be put into the program plans. And then always in a city level, the other layer of accountability is the council members. And those council members can put forward programs and recommendations, and they can also support the the advocacy, and that had worked for us as well. And not just that we have all those relationships, but nonprofits have relationships with their council members, especially if you're, council by district and you're providing programming in that district. Those are connections that those council members will listen to and help advocate for. And so we were able to use different touch points through our programming or other interactions with nonprofits to really be able to, again, ask those questions, because people making these decisions, if you look at any of the plans, I know that we've shared Long Beach's, and you can see the LA County plan. There's competing interests, even just within business recovery. There's so many businesses that do need support, just as nonprofits do, and they are all asking for that. So if we're not asking, it may not be something, we need to ask them to remind them that that's something that needs to be considered when the decisions are being made. So once funding started become available, and this was CARES funding, but it's also going to start soon with the ARPA funding, we were learning from nonprofits about challenges with the system, requirements on the applications. And so that was another point of advocacy, that they're, again, they're creating these programs rather quickly. So hearing things like requiring a business license. Are you requiring that as a city? It's a field in your application. And, is there something we can do so this isn't a barrier to applying? And so things like that we were able to have an open dialogue about, that really changed in real time. That field changed in real time about business licenses. Now the city put some of the ARPA funds into covering business license fees for all businesses and nonprofits that may have been behind. And so these are all things that can happen even after funding is rolled out. So that's a little bit of the story. I don't want to take up too much time on all of the different activities, but a few lessons learned, and, again, asking those questions: where are decisions being made locally? So in the city of Long Beach, those funds are coming. The city manager's office is looking at all the funds and determining programming. They're getting a lot of feedback from the mayor and the city council members. And then, our understanding of business relief being a part of economic development. And in addition to these other resources that are coming out, where nonprofits can be great partners with the city. And so another thing, always being a resource. So in advocacy, if many of you are doing advocacy, knowing that we share what we know, and that's not just in our service area, but how we operate as nonprofits, and how we also need, we lost nonprofits in the first few months in Long Beach when we did a survey, lost 84% of their funding from fundraising activities. That's not something that can be made up in a loan. That's not something that is going to be made up once we reopen. And so how do we also tell that story and use nonprofits to tell that story when these decisions are being made? And then offering solutions, which I know we're really great at. And that's those are solutions, even especially as funds are coming out, and equity is an issue and a question in who we're serving and how funds are being rolled out. And then, I know I've said this a few times, convening with other nonprofits, talking with your colleagues. We don't have the ability to know everything that's going on. So if we were not able to get that information from our nonprofit colleagues, we may not have been able to identify all of the opportunities where we could help advocate. So just closing, before I know if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer. And this really aligns with some of the things Jeff was talking about. There's ongoing work. Plans may be developed. So we know in Long Beach, they started planning for ARPA funding in March, was the first rollout of the plan. It was adopted as part of the budget. LA County has a plan, and that's been adopted, but funds haven't been distributed, and plans may be on paper, but they haven't been rolled out or fully formulated. And so asking how they are being allocated. A lot of local funds for direct services, especially like in Long Beach, there's funds for health equity programming or outreach that nonprofits definitely are best poised to deliver for the city. Those show up in RFPs that are put out very quickly through a planet bid system, that if you don't know where to look or that they're coming, you may miss that, and you may miss those resources. So just understanding when these programs are rolled out, and they will show up in the form of grants and contracts, where you can find out about them. And advocating, again, for streamlined processes within that, contract flexibility, the use of intermediaries, and I think the next speaker may talk a little bit about that. Not all grassroots organizations can apply for these programs and funds, and they may not have the structure to take on a large city contract, but could we partner with larger nonprofits or intermediaries so that funding can get out and resources can get out to the community? And then again, always as nonprofits, we're serving hard to reach communities, asking how the recovery is centering around equity, how resources are centering around equity, and sharing how you can support that in the community. And I know there was a question about funding and what if your city isn't, focused on that. Hopefully there is someone that can champion that with you, or you can be that champion for that. So again, partner with your other nonprofits, and there's still more work to do.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, I would just love it if you could say a little bit more about the equity conversations that happened in the context of talking about ARPA funding. You mentioned it a few times, and you're encouraging nonprofits to ask about equitable distribution, but if you could say a little bit more about how those conversations went.
Sure. Some of that happened at different levels of both CARES funding and ARPA funding. But when we're talking about how and some of this lies mostly in programming, but it also plays into that business support. But nonprofits are working with hard to reach communities. They're providing language access to resources for the community. And so when we're talking about other programs that come through ARPA that nonprofits will deliver, those are things where, the city of Long Beach has an equity lens a toolkit that they want to apply to programming, using their language to advocate for programs going into the hands of nonprofits to be delivered in the city. Or, even as it comes to business support, how are nonprofits being, the small grassroots nonprofits are typically more diverse and have less funding and resources. So asking that question of how they're getting these resources, and also supporting businesses with limited language access or in communities that may not be able to apply. So those technical support aspects of funding. One of the programs that is actually currently kind of in progress that, I know some of the leftover CARES money is getting kind of moved together with ARPA in certain cases, but there is a program for that came out of racial equity funding that came through CARES and ARPA within Long Beach, where they're taking small nonprofits, grassroots nonprofits that are focused on Black health equity and racial equity, and working with them to develop their capacity to apply for these funds when they come back. So this is a way to also that we've been talking about with the city. You can't just put funds out there and expect a small organization with 1 or 2 staff to apply for this RFP with the city or have the requirements that you're requiring. So we're in constant conversations about that equity piece, because we know nonprofits can provide that as a resource to the city. And even in communication about programming, even the business supports, like our nonprofits are business supports of certain communities, like the Cambodian community in Long Beach. And so how do those nonprofits connected with those businesses or other nonprofits help to disseminate information and resources?
That was an absolute wonderful answer. It was actually embedded in my question that your answer was embedded in my question. So I really appreciate that. I just want to highlight that some of the questions were around, could nonprofits apply on their own, or did they have to come in through a city or county? And then there were some other questions about what specific nonprofits could apply. But I think you answered most of those, unless you had anything additional around, what types of nonprofits can apply for the resources.
Yeah, one of the things that we advocated for was for fiscally sponsored organizations to be able to apply. What we found often was it was more geographical, and that may have been whatever was in the federal guidelines. Like you could get a business relief grant if you were located in the city of Long Beach. And so things like that were the other pieces we felt like we could have a little more influence on. But if it came down, and that's where, Jeff's information is helpful, where it came down in the guidelines, that's where we couldn't move the needle on certain things. But, putting an RFP out and saying any nonprofit can apply doesn't actually mean all nonprofits have access. So typically the programs are open to any organization that can do that service area.
Have you seen, this is another one that it keeps showing up in the chat and the question, with regards to education, it looks like everything from early child care to, K through 12, I guess, education. Can those nonprofits apply?
Yes. And, these programs are put together by the city. And I was also just looking at the county programs just the other day, and there are very specific. And that's where I would start for any nonprofit that's wondering, is this affecting the funding that that I can get to? Like for us, we can look at the Long Beach Recovery Act. We could also look at the LA County, and I don't know what they're calling it, but their outline of allocations. very specific. There's youth serving programming, there's health equity programming, programming for seniors. All of those things are all kind of built out into different program areas. And then this is the part that I think is difficult, but this is why other nonprofit colleagues help in this way. They have something in there. There's a line item that gives funding to nonprofits or gives funding to youth organizations. Where does that live? In the county, which department? Is it living in the Office of Violence Prevention? Is it living in the Office of the Department of Mental Health? And so those are questions that have to be asked, because and then unfortunately, they don't always talk to each other well. And so, even for the nonprofit relief money in Long Beach, it started out as they can get some of this funding that come through small businesses. Well, then the health department, because they usually work with nonprofits, was going to distribute some of that funding. Well, then they had 14 different programs that they were supposed to put out for CARES funding. And we, we're helping in some of those cases being an intermediary, but they didn't have the time to put that relief out. And there was already a system in economic development. So it went back. And so they're still working on how to get these funds out quickly. And one of the other areas that I would say to advocate for is prioritizing your program area. So they're developing, if you look at any list, I'm sure there's 20 different places where there's different programs that are going to be delivered eventually over the next 3 years, but how are they prioritizing that? And that it's a question I have, and that we still, will be asking, what's being prioritized? Is it prioritized when we come together as a group of nonprofits and tell them that it's a priority and give them a solution to how to get the funding out quickly? And so those are all, I think, ways to kind of explore what's happening for you and your communities.
Thank you. Michelle, thank you for your presentation. And I'm sure we'll have more questions at the end. But I want to thank you again for your presence and for your presentation. Now I'd like to introduce Marian Kaanon, CEO of the Stanislaus Community Foundation. Welcome, Marian.
Thanks, David. So good to be with all of you today. And I'll build on Michelle's presentation first by telling you a little bit about what happened in our community and how that's influenced what's happening with ARPA funds, and then broaden it so that it really applies to all of you. And I want to leave you with a series of considerations and questions. So in Stanislaus County, Stanislaus Community Foundation, we're in the heart of the Central Valley, a county of about 540,000 people. Unlike many of the coastal regions, we're very philanthropically undersourced. There's not a lot of organized philanthropy. And so in a community like ours, the biggest funder in town, just like many of yours, is county government and city government. And so we very early on have always understood that, really, but certainly during COVID, we recognized that funding was going to be flowing through our counties and cities in terms of relief funding. But let's go back to the first days of COVID. On March 13th, 2020, the Community Foundation began to see, we canceled an event that we were having, and we began to see the bottom drop out as schools began to close. We recognized school-based nonprofits had to shutter a lot of their operations. A lot of our food and basic needs, shelter services organizations were experiencing increased demand. Our senior serving organizations certainly increased demand. So a lot was happening. It was impacting every single nonprofit in our community. So we set up a live poll right away to really get a finger on the pulse of what was happening with nonprofits. We also began to organize a funder collaborative of the other organized philanthropies, another private foundation in our local United Way, along with a lot of our public agencies, our county heads, to understand at the time, what they were funding. And so we began to track both the needs of the nonprofits and understand how people were prioritizing funding from the public sense. Also, as a community foundation, we obviously have a number of donors that are really invested in our community. And so they began to ramp up their giving. And we used the poll to really communicate to our donors, here's the issues our nonprofits are experiencing. Please give in the form of general operating support, no strings attached. And I will tell you, our donors tripled their giving just in the past year of COVID, and really doubled down on their investments in nonprofits. Significant grants went out from our little community foundation. But we also began to work with the county when they got CARES Act funding. So they actually used the community foundation as the intermediary. And what we recognized is that CARES Act funding came into the county. they already had prioritized COVID relief, both through their entities, their public health department, but also through several nonprofits that are a bit larger that could really get out into community. They also began to provide cash aid through our Family Resource Center. So they really stepped up to the plate and responded to sort of what was happening in the community through direct grants to nonprofits that could really provide services around COVID relief. But they also recognized, because of the polling we were doing, that the people left behind in our community, the nonprofits, were performing arts organizations and youth serving organizations. We're sort of last in line for our donors, and certainly last in line in terms of public funding, because they weren't providing COVID relief. And so they set up a $1 million grant cycle through the Community Foundation that we administered last fall. And that all happened very agile. It was a very agile and nimble grant cycle. We set up a community grants review community that was representative of our community, and we were able to get that money out very quickly. So again, thinking about, I heard Michelle say and others that sometimes the counties and cities are challenged because not only are they responding to the public health crisis, now they're getting funding flowing to them that they have to make decisions on very quickly. So we've always been a really good partner to the county on many different things. So they really saw us and the United Way as good intermediaries to be able to do that nimble, agile response to nonprofits. So one thing there I would say is find out who your local intermediaries are. They may be other place-based funders like your local Community Foundation, United Way, or other nonprofit serving organizations that may be serving as intermediaries to pass through these grants onto nonprofits if your counties and cities have prioritized grants to nonprofits as either good use of CARES or ARPA funding. So that all happened in the last year. So then the other thing that's interesting is I think we have to remember that our counties and cities are exhausted. And they're human beings at the end of the day that have their hands on this lever. And they have been, in case I think all of you have noticed, ground zero for mask wars, vaccine wars. Every elected body has, protests around it, unlike they've ever seen before. At the same time, they're responding to the public health crisis, the economic crisis, in many of our communities, the wildfire crisis, and they're being inundated by funding requests. So I think we have to have a little empathy and compassion for what's happening at the local level among our cities and counties, and wherever possible, really begin with that place and begin to organize ourselves as a collective in our communities to speak, not in behalf sometimes of our own services or programs, but around the needs of our communities and how we as nonprofits are responding to those needs as a collective, so that if there are grant cycles that are open, they really are responsive. And we certainly saw that in 2020 with the county entrusting us to help support performing arts and youth serving organizations. But what we also did, recognizing the exhaustion of our city and county staff, is we published 2 reports. We did a series of webinars that were well attended and sort of real-time issues for nonprofits and for donors. So sort of 2 different groups that we were focused on, kind of bringing them along with what was happening real time. But we also published a report on our economy and who was getting left behind. And I'll be honest with you, we were doing that work pre-COVID, but certainly highlighted all the disparities that came to bear and that were in full view, as David mentioned earlier, during COVID. So we published that, and we also published at the end of last year a nonprofit survey, a nonprofit sector report, and that's all available on our website, both of those reports. And it allowed us to be a thoughtful thought partner to the county. They really took notice of both reports because they have not had the time to sort of reflect and make sense of what was happening. They're literally in reaction mode. So moving into 2021, when the ARPA funding came, they took notice of both reports. They read through them. They asked us to present on both reports, one on our economy and the state of our economy, and one on the nonprofit sector. And so using ARPA funds, they've prioritized, there's a grant cycle open now, again, through the Community Foundation, prioritizing nonprofits serving veterans and seniors and historically disadvantaged communities. So they really trusted us, again, based on our nonprofit sector report, to provide general operating support to those nonprofits. So we're doing that right now. But they also, and this is, I think, something that we need to be thinking about through the lens of ARPA funding, is certainly one thing to react and respond to the current economic crisis or who's been left behind or how, but we know that these are historically ongoing disparities. And so we really went to the county and said, it's the right time, a window of this opportunity is open for us to develop a process that's about reinvesting in our community, using some of our ARPA funds to change the longstanding inequities in our region. And they agreed. And so we're embarking on this month a 10-month sprint process to develop an investment agenda with key priority plans for workforce development and economic development, co-led by the private sector. So the Community Foundation raised $200,000. The county committed $450,000 of ARPA funds, and we're using that funding to take a deep dive into the data around our community, to authentically engage community and center community voice, and really understand who's participating in our economy, who is not, what are the barriers to economic mobility. So we're also using this as an opportunity to vault ahead as a community, not to sort of just react real time. And that is all important too, but it's also a time to get really clear about what we want the next decade, the next 2 decades, the next 5 decades to look like. And so, no good crisis should go, unused or whatever, that underutilized. So we're really taking this time, again, as a thought partner to the county, to say this is the right time to come and change things for the better long term. And so we're beginning that process in our community. So I want you all to be thinking about, as nonprofits, as you think about ARPA funding, be thinking about who's advocating on behalf of nonprofits in your community. Do you have an organization like Michelle's in Long Beach? Is it your local place-based funder? Is there a nonprofit advocacy group in your area? But beyond that, who's also influencing the decisions on your elected boards? Who's really influencing the decisions that are making on how they're using this funding? Because although there are certain uses, as Jeff pointed out, they're still fairly flexible and broad. And so who's really ultimately influencing those decisions? Because all those decisions are happening at the local level. And I think it's important to know, if you read the wording around ARPA funding, and I know it's been linked, that it does prioritize disenfranchised and disadvantaged communities, and it makes racial disparities explicit. So talk about a window of opportunity that's opened up around agile, flexible funding in our communities for the communities that have historically been left behind and left out of these decisions and this funding. I also think understanding that our government staff have decision fatigue. They are exhausted. And so wherever we can be thoughtful partners to them and represent our issues in advance of our services and programs that we're advocating for, whether it's a report, whether it's a webinar that a collective nonprofits can develop and provide to their elected officials, I think that would really help them to frame the issues impacting the communities you serve and the clients you serve, versus every nonprofit being like that sharp elbows, that does, as funders, it's hard to see that. Whereas when we see a collection of nonprofits advocating on behalf of an issue and then talking about services, certainly changes the tone and tenor of the conversation. And then forming a coalition of nonprofits, certainly, I would say all of those things are really important. And again, I would just say, I do think this is a window of opportunity for many of our communities, if not all of them, to sort of rectify and address, finally, longstanding inequities in our regions, and being in partnership with government. I always say philanthropy has agility and government has scale. And when you blend those two things together, and I would say nonprofits have agility and obviously government has scale. And so when you partner meaningfully with your local electeds, it has the ability to make real change. So really excited about this time we're entering, but also recognizing where everyone is in their decision-making abilities is, I think, critical for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. And I just want to remind everybody attending the webinar that this webinar goes until 11:15, so we still will have lots of great time for questions. So I hope everybody can stay until then. I guess I'll start with a question for you. From our Q&A, were conversations about how to provide protections and supports for essential workers part of what you all talked about in Stanislaus?
They were, and also I should say that with both the CARES Act funding and the ARPA funding, some of the funding directly went to support both companies and nonprofits serving essential workers. So that happened outside of the grant cycles we were providing for more of, I would say, traditional nonprofits, or sort of more programmatic general operating support. But the county did set aside, I believe, $5 million in ARPA funds and $5 million in CARES Act funding for both companies that employ, and there are in Stanislaus County, the Central Valley, we are a community of essential workers. It's part of the reason our COVID rate, heartbreakingly, was so high. And so the county really recognized that. I will tell you, we did have to apply some political pressure to make that happen. So again, I think it behooves all of us to understand who's influencing some of these decisions and talking, and they're not often the people sometimes that are on the dais. So really understanding that would be helpful in all of your communities.
I'm curious, Marian, thank you so much for your presentation. Just from the philanthropic point of view, if there are philanthropists on the call that want to get involved in their individual regions or communities, what piece of advice? I heard very clearly the advice for nonprofits, and how to get involved. But for funders, what would be your piece of advice if they want to get involved in helping to make sure these funds are allocated equitably?
Sure. So I will tell you, I would say, for any donor, any private donor, general operating support is sorely needed. We have a series of recommendations on our nonprofit sector report, and we actually broke it out for private donors versus organized philanthropy versus government funders. But all of them, we gave the same advice around general operating support. Don't tie this to any timeframes, to any programs. These nonprofits just need this funding right now. And our county really stepped up to that with the funding that they've directed through us. I would say that's probably the biggest thing. Also, if they can get their hands on any nonprofit reports that are real time, that have captured sort of what's happening with nonprofits, that would be helpful. I will tell you, I've been amazed at how our donors not only stepped up to provide that general operating support. We had 2 donors step up and create a gift card program through us. So we funded it. They both have funds with us to our local downtown partnership, and they match dollar for dollar any amount that a community member puts on the gift card. And it's a gift card to shop at participating downtown retailers and restaurants. This was in the height of COVID, when the bottom was falling out of our restaurants and our retailers downtown. And so they matched up to $250,000. So we could put up to $200 on a gift card. It would become $400. So the win-win there is me as a resident gets added money. So if I'm struggling, I can double my money for these things. The philanthropist is just adding that money. And so basically, it was a very innovative thing that a donor just did through us to a local nonprofit, our downtown partnership, that could create this gift card program. And then the county and the city allocated $2 million into that gift card program and brought it into the whole county versus our county seat, our local city that we started it on. So I saw a lot of those types of agile, nimble solutions coming from our donors that you wouldn't necessarily typically. It just called for a heightened creativity. So I would say get creative, be in conversation with your local nonprofits, and it can really yield amazing things. And now that little downtown nonprofit is providing that gift card program beyond our cities and our counties to other communities in the state, which is just incredible. And all started with 2 donors on our end that wanted to start this gift card program.
Thank you.
I'm thinking if we could have the other speakers also back on, and maybe we'll open the question and answer up to Jeff and Michelle and Marianne, if that's okay with you all. And you can jump in with answers to the questions. Whoever wants to answer, we can have multiple answers too. So here's a question. How do we find out at the local level who is making these decisions concerning these funds? How do we find out who the decision makers are? Jump in, whoever wants to take that one.
Go ahead, Marian.
Ultimately, obviously, the people that cast the vote are your county board of supervisors and your city councils. But I would look at city staff and county staff, because they're also the ones that are crafting these decisions, these policy decisions for our electeds. But also, if you can host a webinar with local nonprofits and bring in your electeds, Brown Act will mean you can only bring in a minority vote, but begin to sort of lay the case for what your nonprofit is doing, both to advance vitality in your community and the struggles that have happened in the last year and a half. But I would say city and county staff, certainly your electeds are the ones that cast the ultimate vote.
That's great, because staff often have more time and are more accessible too. They're a great starting point. Michelle, did you want to add to that?
I agree. And I think that if you don't know where to go within the city department, asking your electeds that question, and also about the, events and webinars. When resources started coming down, we invited the city staff to come and talk about the resources on a webinar for the nonprofits. And so how, being able to engage them in that way also gets, nonprofits at the forefront of what they're doing. But again, you can ask your electeds if you don't know where to find the resources, especially the ones that are serving your district.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, and I think this was sort of implicit in what Marian and Michelle have said, that while you're always, the Brown Act says that you're always able to make comments at public meetings, and there's a lot of emphasis on turning people out to public meetings to influence decisions. Remember that you can contact your elected officials anytime. Depending on the size of the county, they might or might not have staff. A lot of counties, the supervisors don't have staff, or maybe all 5 of them share one staff person. In the larger counties, they'll have maybe several staff. You can always reach out. You can meet with them outside of public meetings, as long as Marian pointed out, as long as you're not meeting with the majority of them or trying to create consensus around a vote before it happens. Those things aren't allowed, but you can always reach out.
Thank you. I was curious. I saw a question earlier, and I'm not sure if it was already answered. Just around organizations that are operating, and I know this is mostly about the state of California, but if they're operating in California and serving multiple states, multiple areas, what is the best way for them to be able to fund those programs? Do they have to go state by state, or how does that work? I don't know, Jeff, if that's a good one for you, or.
Yeah, I mean, there aren't any, I think so, yes, because there's no, there's no specific, there's no sort of nationwide or regional ARPA funds. It's all, again, I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning. There were a lot of other funds in ARPA for various things. We're talking specifically about the, what was it, 150 billion, I don't remember the nationwide number. But in California, we're talking specifically about the 42 billion in state and local fiscal recovery funds, and it's really specifically for. We've gone over the uses, but just to give the maybe 5,000 foot view, it's really for COVID response, public health and economic, and it's for revenue loss. It's for and frankly, as I think implicit in it, the economic shot in the arm, right? The recovery shot in the arm that it will provide by getting all this money out into every local community. So I don't know that there's a sort of multi-state way to lobby for these funds. I do think it would be jurisdiction by jurisdiction, whether that's state by state or local agency by local agency.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I agree with that assessment. This might be a question for you also. Are there specific set-asides in ARPA for tribal governments?
Yes, there were. We're talking about the 26 billion or 27 billion for the state, but tribal governments, and I'm not an expert on it, so I don't know if it's all of them or if it's certain classifications of them, also received money directly from Treasury Department, both for these fiscal recovery funds, but also for other funds. So another big one, for example, are the capital projects funds. It was a $10 billion pot in ARPA, a totally different criteria for going out. None of it went to local agencies directly. But for example, in that one, a $10 billion pot, each state, territory got a $100 million minimum, and then tribal governments also got direct allocations from that. So that is for those of the folks on this webinar who operate in tribal areas, that is another place to go to see what they have available.
Thank you. This one could be for anyone. What thoughts, guidance do you have for counties that aren't as open to community input, especially from some of the underserved communities?
This is your job. Then I think that's where nonprofits can shine. You're talking for the community. So you're speaking about the needs of the community. It's where you take the information you know about the people that you're serving and share it and get together and share it again and find, if they aren't listening, then I guess you are going to those public comment and writing letters or utilizing your local papers or other places. But I think that's then where our advocacy becomes more important. And so luckily in the city of Long Beach, there is an equity. We can point to things. It doesn't mean they're always doing it, but we can point to things that they have established or have aspirations to have and call them out on those things. And that's where maybe it's the city department that isn't necessarily friendly to that feedback, but talking to your elected officials could help. And so there's different levels depending on where you're finding the roadblocks that I think that you can leverage there. And the other part is somebody, finding, is it a board member? Is it another nonprofit that has another person that is connected that actually can get through to the people that you're trying to talk to? So that's, again, why it's important for us to work together as nonprofits when we're advocating for all of these things.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. So, Jeff, you mentioned that counties have preliminary plans. People are wondering, where can they see those plans? And others may have answers for that too in your locales, but where can nonprofit leaders go to find out what the county plans are, or city plans for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, I'm unfortunately somebody who spends a lot of my time, as much of my time as I can, honestly, deep in spreadsheets and budget documents. That's my happy place when I'm putting. So I don't know that that's the case for everybody, but you can go into the adopted budget documents for counties and cities and find it in there for individual counties and cities. If you can't find it, that'll be specifically for the budgeted period. So it might not be all of the funds, but you can also, I think, reach out to your elected official, county supervisor, or city council member and ask them, hey, what are you guys doing with this money? I think I know a number of counties in particular have just sort of either a website or a document where they said, hey, here's what we're going to do with all the money. We might spend it over the next 3 or 4 years, but here's the plan in one easy to access place. But it's not required for folks to have done that. And then, once they have, I guess, spent the money, but there are reporting requirements for every jurisdiction, state level on down, to report their spending back to Treasury Department. Because if you spend it in a way you're not allowed to, they can take it back. That's sort of implicit in all federal funds and explicit with this federal fund. So there are reporting requirements. I think the first reports are due in January, I think at the end of January. And so those will, and those have certain requirements on how they spend it or how to report the spending. So there will be that eventually, but those don't exist yet.
As a follow-up, I guess, because there was a similar question around the spending by counties and the reporting. You mentioned the Treasury Department. Is that also public? Will that be published for the general community to be able to see that spending report?
I suspect it will be public through Treasury, but I mean, it is the work product of a government. So, I mean, theoretically, it's not a draft or anything. So theoretically, even if it's not public on Treasury's website, it is still considered a public document. So it should be gettable, given the laws here in California anyway.
Are you familiar with the frequency of that reporting requirement, or?
You would think I would be. Let me take a look real quick and I'll get back. I feel, for CRF, it was monthly, I believe. Which was a bit onerous. And I believe this is quarterly, but let me double check real quick and circle back.
Thank you.
Well, this is a slightly higher level kind of more general question. How can we as nonprofits and funders stay informed about relevant funding opportunities that come through, that are like pass through federal funding like this, but that come to local governments?
Go ahead, Marian.
No, I mean, for us, I think unfortunately, nonprofits do have to be diligent if there isn't one source of those funding opportunities to look at the county and city websites for public funding opportunities. I will tell you now, as someone who's about to go into contract with our county for ARPA funds, there's a tremendous amount of, as you can imagine, just legal language and legal, you have to abide by certain reporting requirements. So it's pretty intensive, but I think that's why the county, working through the, at least for us, the community foundation, we're able to free them up of some of that. So the nonprofits ultimately are just getting the funding and not having to comply with a lot of those regs, especially for general operating support. But for our community, we don't have one source where it sort of compiles all of those opportunities. Michelle, I don't know if you know, I think every community is going to look a little different around how organized they are, unfortunately.
Yes, we tried to find, like I mentioned this when I was speaking earlier, we try to pay attention and share what we know, and we put out information with resources to our email list. Cal Nonprofits is a great resource to us, sharing information when we are wondering what's happening with something, or we hear there's funding coming down. We may set up a call with Lucy or see what they have on their website to see where, you know, things are when we're writing even advocacy letters or, you know, asking for recommendations. We're also using those resources that Cal Nonprofits has put out or other organizations. So this is where, and I think a lot of these associations are probably sharing information in the same ways when they're coming out. But I think just being connected in that way and just being around, it's hard. We're not all back in person and we're doing some sort of hybrid, but if you can be around other nonprofits, especially those doing similar work, you may hear about that. And then I would say Cal Nonprofits has helped us just keeping aware of things. I think early on when there was a local, I think it was the South Bay out in LA, but you had a session with one of the elected officials who listed out how much funding each of those cities were going to have. And then I went to affinity groups that we had and said, look, we know what Long Beach is getting because they're talking about it because they don't, you know, they're always putting together a plan for something, but you know, Hawthorne is getting 2 million and this city is getting this much. And so that was helpful for us just to know that each of those cities were getting the funding, and then we could at least share what we were doing so they could kind of model that. But all those associations and Cal Nonprofits in particular has been helpful for us.
So if I can come back to the reporting, is this an appropriate time? Because I forgot a sort of important thing, which is that for larger jurisdictions, those over 250,000 residents, which is about half of the counties in California, and maybe something like 15 cities over 250,000, they have to provide that full performance report. That's basically summary of here's what we're going to do with the money. So for those jurisdictions, you can just find that. It's a required report. It'll certainly be on their website. For smaller jurisdictions, that reporting will be either quarterly or annual, depending on the size of the jurisdiction. And everybody will have to do that.
Thank you, Jeff. Laura, looks like you are up next.
Well, thank you for spending your Friday morning with us, learning about the American Rescue Plan Act and opportunities for access, advocacy, engagement by the social sector. If you're here today, or if you're not, but you registered, you will get an email with the recording, the slides, the resources that you've seen populated into the chat. This will go out within a week or so, again, to all registered participants. It also will be linked from the Cal Nonprofits website, where even now you can find recordings and resources from all past installments of the California Policy Forum Roundtables. I want to give a special thanks to our wonderful speakers, our co-moderators, to the California Policy Forum partners, and to our awesome tech team, and also Jody, our very talented and quick typing captioner. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and we will see you at the next California Policy Forum.